Welcome back. Last we closed off was chapter 46 about strong opinions weakly held. I think probably these little chunks, I'm going to see if they fold into some larger topic so they're not like little tiny bits compared to some of these other ones. Like interviewing is huge, and then there's these others that are, anyhow, neither here nor there. So we picked up with remote work. Now, not everybody's going to be in a position where you have work from home, but it does feel like to a large degree a trend that was already well underway when COVID hit was really pushed into hyperdrive by COVID, which is working from home, or just working across teams that are remote, right? Like the remote work includes not just people working from home, but people working from satellite offices, working with outsourced teams or just distributed teams. You might have East Coast offices and West Coast offices, or you might have an engineering team in Ukraine or something. There's a lot of different ways to work across time zones without that sort of we can all get in a room together. So the thesis that's been sort of going around in the management community is that, well, maybe managers aren't all that necessary because, managers are just sort of like to stand over people and make sure they get their jobs done, and they're doing that from home. What do we need managers for? And there are companies that have incredibly flat structures, like Google. The fan in, I think, in most of their teams is like 20-1 or something ridiculous. And I think, based on everything I've said here, is a very, very sort of short-sighted and narrow view of what leadership does. And I'm not saying you should have one manager for every two employees. That would be ridiculous. But I think having managers have enough time to be able to look down the field and do all these other things that we've been talking about still has value. And to the extent that the pendulum swings in the direction of Google and Twitter and do we really need managers, I think history shows that we do. And remote work does make that harder because there is something lost when you don't have the FaceTime, the water cooler conversations and whatever. And that's not specific to management, but here's how it applies to management. Sort of most obviously, it makes it harder to directly observe people's behaviors, especially when you're in a meeting and everybody's on Zoom and people are sort of intermittently turning their cameras on and off. You lose a lot of eye contact, body language. You can still pick up on tone of voice and what have you, but I find that Zoom meetings are often way less lively than an in-person conversation. The tools still aren't as fluid as having a whiteboard and so on and so forth. Actually, I'll refer to that in point E, but the part where managers spend a fair amount of time observing dynamics, how individuals behave, how groups behave, how people treat each other, and so on and so forth. Yeah, that gets harder because those interactions are often happening out of earshot, out of sight. A lot of times they're happening in places like, Discord or Slack, sometimes email conversations or whatever, sometimes phone calls. There's a lot of communication channels that sort of get pushed into the fore when you're working with a distributed team. And so you have to make a more conscientious effort to not just kind of sit back and, listen to what people are saying. You have to make the effort to kind of check in where you can without being creepy on these other channels, particularly, if you're using Slack or Discord, one of those sort of, media for chatting. A lot of the work gets done in those, or they get done in sort of the breakout rooms, the engineering sessions where you might not normally include a manager, like it's just the ICs, doing their jobs or whatever. And so you rely more on indirect messages from people. You empower your team to, bring concerns to you in a way that doesn't make them into, tattletales, but if you see that the team dynamic is suffering because somebody is being rude or inconsiderate or flaky or what have you, um, you need to have that information be deliverable in a way where the person who's delivering it, feels safe saying, oh, I've noticed a pattern where, so and so's, flaking off or whatever. And then once you get that information, we talked about this earlier in the section about discretion. It's best if you can go and find a way to sort of validate that on your own instead of going to the person that's, maybe possibly misbehaving. And, sometimes there's false reports or one-offs or, just somebody has it in for somebody and you have to be able to detect all that too. But as much as possible, you want to put yourself in a position to see whatever the behavior is so that you can say, oh, I saw you do a thing and that's not great because reasons and, whatever, all the downstream stuff from that. So, and tone is lost a lot. And, I've had people come to me many times and say, oh, well, did you see what so-and-so put in the chat? That was totally out of line or whatever. And I'll go and read it. And I'll be like, I guess I can kind of see why you see it that way. And sometimes, I have to ask for clarification. I'm like, okay, I'm not seeing it. What in this set you off? It's like, oh, well, so-and-so's clearly throwing this other person under the bus. I'm like, oh, you're referring to something else that was 10 pages back or 10 days ago or whatever, right? Like where you were able to pick out the pattern. I'm not seeing the pattern. So sometimes you have to ask for that kind of clarification. Again, you don't go to the person that's misbehaving if you can help it, without firsthand observations. And you won't always be able to do that. But again, whatever you do with information that you get, that's in confidence, has to be treated very, very carefully. So, and the thing about, people being disrespectful or snippy or, the things that are maybe harder to definitely see when it's just in text, right? That you're not, picking up on it or whatever. Like when you're all face to face, it's a lot easier to pick up on like tone and body language and stuff like that, where somebody's, putting out sort of subtle bad vibes or throwing shade on someone with some consistency or what have you. And really you want to catch that stuff as early as you can, because it's that destruction of social capital that's really toxic, right? When you don't trust somebody to not be a jerk, then that erodes trust and social capital in a way that makes it harder to work with that person. You tend to be less inclined to be forthcoming with them. If you're maybe less inclined to help them with problems, now the more adult on average your team is, the less that's going to be a deal breaker, right? A very, senior person is going to be able to be like, okay, well, it doesn't matter if that person's a jerk or not. Still need to work with them. We still need to accomplish our goals or whatever. But it's just that extra amount of effort. Well, I don't want to work with that person, right? Like people have feelings, they have emotions, they respond, negatively to, the things that I'm describing as bad behaviors. So, trying to get ahead of those little problems before they turn into big problems, before trust and other forms of social capital erode, is important. And that's harder. And so you just have to up your game there compared to what it's like, being in the office. So, and, that's talking about, sort of loss of social capital. Building social capital is that much harder, right? Like if you're not having those group lunches, if you're not going out for dinner, if you're not, having the on-sites or whatever it is that you do, to build social capital interpersonally. I'm not saying it can't be done. People, meet over Zoom, and there's several people at Lacuna I never ever did meet face to face and developed relationships with. It's just, it was more work. So this is a, level of effort that is a little bit harder to do, and coming up with thoughtful ways to do it that aren't like corny or don't feel like a waste of time. Like, Lacuna, we did the, offsite, onsite, which is a contradiction, obviously, but, we would pick a day where we weren't working on, regular stuff, and we would have presentations and whatever. And we did several of those over the years, particularly during the pandemic, obviously. And later post-pandemic, when it was more about conserving money than anything else, then you had this challenge of, can you organize something like this where people aren't doing like their regular day job, where they don't feel it's just completely pointless? We definitely had some of those on sites that just felt like a giant freaking waste of time, and people were, it checked out, or they would turn off their video and surf the web or what have you. And it was frustrating. And we had some, I thought, that were sort of more tight, more focused, more sort of productivity oriented, and maybe they didn't build as much social capital per se, but they didn't feel like a waste of time. And there were things that we did together. So what's going to work and what isn't, I don't have like the automatic winner checklist. It kind of depends on the circumstances and the people and so on and so forth. And we could go into some of the details, but that's less I'm giving you a blueprint to solve them, and more I'm telling you that these are harder problems to solve, and they're going to be fairly specific to whatever situation you find yourself in. There's less sort of informal exchange of information. You don't hear somebody over the monitors, like grumbling about whatever, and you pick up on it and you're like, hey, is there anything I can do for you, or whatever. Like, people have to very explicitly ask for help, right? And when the energy barrier to asking for help is high, or at least is perceived to be high, people are less inclined to do it. And that can really slow teams down. I think, for example, we had a guy at Lacuna, Peter, who I think might have, this is a hypothesis, might have done a lot better, like in an actual office. He hated asking for help. And I think that's one of the reasons that he struggled so mightily. And it's the sort of thing that even if he hadn't asked for help, if people like see him just like staring and not typing for, 20 minutes at a time because you're in the same room together or what have you, maybe say like, hey, is there anything I can help with? Right? Like that sort of volunteering, again, lowers the energy level. And that's just not really a thing that happens when you're at home by yourself with the mic off. Like, people aren't going to interrupt you and say, hey, can I help you do something? Right? Like, you're losing these nonverbal cues. And that makes, everything a little bit harder. Now, of course, there's lots of great things about remote work, and I'm not going to try to adjudicate that. I'm just talking about specifically, once you've decided to remote work for whatever reason, these are some of the things you have to adjust to. Another thing, I touched on this earlier, there's a lot of value, I think, in just having, whiteboards. And I know that there's whiteboarding apps out there, but I've never seen any that really took, or any that just were so low friction where like I want to dash out a diagram. I mean, even in this sort of my little lecture series, right? I don't have my whiteboard that I can refer to and draw like my 2x2s and stuff. I'm gonna have to go offline and add those into the doc, as sort of addenda. And maybe when I re-record, I'll have some visual references. But some of the tools that we use in person, beyond nonverbal cues and all that stuff, are also not easily available. Now, some things have improved dramatically, like co-editing documents has gotten a lot easier. Obviously, screen sharing and stuff is a partial replacement, and like pairing is probably even easier when you're screen sharing than when you're like, one person's like staring over the other person's shoulder. I think that's a place where, the improvements in tooling to try to solve some of these problems have been kind of a win. So, moving on, part F. Yeah, past a certain size, remote group discussions tend to get dominated by one or two people. And that can be very much true also face to face. I think it's magnified a little bit in remote work, that once somebody gets ahead of steam, it's a little harder perhaps to interrupt them. This isn't, a real firm assertion on my part. This is just sort of an impression I have, that maybe I should try to collect some data on it somehow. But any group discussion is at risk of being dominated by a small number of people, but I think remote makes it worse. Technical difficulties can be a real freaking impediment. Certainly internet and so on has gotten sort of asymptotically better over the years, but it still drops out from time to time. I think we've all been in that meeting where like, the presenter like has to turn off their video, to be able to continue, or there's like latency and hiccups, drop packets or whatever, just dropped calls, right? And you're like waiting for the, somebody to notice that, oh, they need to, get back in. I was having a call with a friend of mine just yesterday, and just this tool that he and I use day in and day out, Zoom. He's like, oh, I'm having Zoom problems, right? Or I'm going to be late because Zoom insists on doing an upgrade now, right? Those are things that just don't happen when you're walking into somebody's cube to talk to them, or getting in a conference room together or what have you. And it can be, frustrating. And, if you've got consistent problems for one person, they tend to drop out of the conversations. If they can't follow along, then it's going to be difficult for them to contribute. And if you've got someone who's got that consistently, then it's going to just constantly corrode the ability for people to, be part of the team. Also, like if you've got any kind of a mix at all, that is a huge set of its own challenges, because people tend to want to take advantage of the parts of in-person that are really great, the whiteboard or the whatever. But the people that aren't immediately in the group don't have access to the same tools. If they can't write on the whiteboard, they're not equal participants. One of the ways we address that at Lacuna is that people that were present, like everybody had their laptop on, right? So everybody had their own face. Now we would mute like all but one, or we'd have the speaker in the middle of the room or what have you. And that ended up, taking some trial and error to get right. But in the end, I think that was reasonably effective. But you can't have the remote people be second-class citizens, because then it's just frustrating and, to reuse that word, disenfranchising. And the tendency when collaboration is harder, it ups the likelihood that people are going to just go off and do it, like without asking, without considering, whatever, right? Hopefully in a perfect world, everybody's mature enough not to do that, to realize that's a problem. But, when you're feeling this pressure to solve something and you feel like the tech is just getting in your way, even though, of course, we're all working in tech, the remote work tech is getting in the way. There's this like, I'm just going to go solve this problem tendency. And I've seen that over and over as well. I think, again, we did a pretty good job at Lacuna of managing that, but not always. So, all right. So that's the chapter on remote work. Any questions, comments, additions you'd like to recommend?
Just with remote work, what I've noticed that helps, and obviously it's not the same, it's not comparable, but just like having like a coffee time with your immediate team members, or having like 15-20 minutes on Zoom, just hanging out, so that because I didn't meet most of the people at Lacuna in person. There were very few people I met, I had met only a handful of people. So,
Well, and some people, like with the on-site offsites or offsite onsites or whatever, will find that, it will feel to them like a waste of time. And, you have to manage that. You have to scope it to where people feel like it's productive, right? And, it is hard, like someone that you've never met, to sort of establish that relationship with them, especially if, one or both of you is, sort of much more introverted by nature. Like, we all worked with, not to single anybody out, but there was one project person at Lacuna who never turned on their video, like not ever. And I get it, like that person had some sort of psychological issue about being on camera, but boy, did it make it difficult to think of this person as anything other than, a voice that managed schedules, and that was it. And I don't know how that person would be in person. I don't know, like maybe face to face it wouldn't have been a problem. Maybe this person was never going to come into an office. I don't know. So I can't say that there's a uniform set of solutions to these things, but
yeah.
yeah.
Because generally that's what happened even at the previous company, because I joined my previous company in person, and then within like I think 2 or 3 weeks we went to remote. So then we hired the rest of the QA team, and we hadn't actually ever met the QA team. And then what happened is my boss, he was like, let's schedule like a coffee break together every Friday so we could like bond as a team.
Yeah.
And we were actually one of the most like bonded teams. We're still friends right now, even after not working there, you know?
Yep.
So,
Yeah. And
anyways,
this
that was
is
just my
a
2 cents.
try things. Don't be afraid to
Mhm.
try things and fail. Just, and it's actually, it's a perfect segue from Strong Opinions Weekly Held. Be willing to try things, have strong opinions like, we're going to do this thing. I think this is going to be useful, helpful, or whatever. And you can't be afraid of failure. And, failure is the wrong word, right? When you try an experiment, even if you don't get the outcome you were hoping for or expecting, it doesn't mean it was a failure, right? It's just the wrong word. It means you learned something. It means, okay, that didn't work. Specifically, can we understand why it didn't work so that the next thing we try will not have any of those particular failure modes? Or maybe the failure modes like sort of directly point to do the opposite thing. And I don't have like a really concrete example of that at hand, but like being willing to experiment, but also to listen carefully to people and try new things and abandon experiments that didn't go the way you wanted. That's a really powerful part of growth and leadership. And it gives other people, like, you're modeling that behavior of like, okay, sometimes it's okay to just try things, not knowing if they are going to work. You don't have to camp out exclusively in your strengths or your, known solutions and what have you. Because that people like that are, brittle, they're static. So,
So I have just one more thing to say about the Hangout thing. It didn't work in a different situation. So it worked for us on our team, but then when we would have it with the rest of the engineering team, we would have like breakout rooms after the engineering meeting. People would just keep dropping off and nobody would stick around.
Right.
So there are obviously downsides to both, right?
All right. So that's the end of what I have for principles. And now we'll move on to part 5, getting your shot, which is I'm an IC. I want that first leadership role, or at least I think I do. Now what? So let's start with sort of the background of why is getting that first manager job so hard, possibly the hardest thing. There's argument about whether becoming a manager at all is the hardest thing, or making the leap to VP. I think getting to VP is actually the second hardest thing. But there's, it's up for debate. But just getting into leadership, I think it's the biggest leap. And that's, it's right there in the text. It's the biggest leap. And I think we've addressed this sort of piecemeal over the curriculum, but let's put all of these topics sort of in concentrated form. Leaders are force multipliers, right? A bad IC can have toxic effects beyond the individual, whether or not they perform or not. They definitely can be underperformers or HR nightmares or whatever, but usually that's pretty contained to one person's worth of harm. A leader can just absolutely wreck an entire team. And I think all of us have seen each of the following at one point or another in our careers. If you make a bad hire, and sometimes bad hires happen, but like consistently bad hires, or having the wrong motivation, or just having a poor skill set for assessing, talent or whatever. There was one team of 3 people at Lacuna where 2 of them were very obviously not great hires. And one, it's not that he was a bad hire, he was just like way too junior for the role. Like, and we compensated or whatever, but like, I wouldn't call it 0 for 3, but pretty close. And that just caused all sorts of, collateral, challenges for everyone else. A bad leader can, demotivate their entire team. Like if they're just not attentive, if they're not, taking care of their people, if they're not clearing obstacles, all the things that we've talked about, if they're just not doing the things that are important for the team, then, the team's gonna go someplace else. The individuals are gonna go, screw this, I don't have to put up with this crap. Unless the economy is totally in the shitter, they're gonna find the grass is always greener. And I find that, like, one of the things that's, if you find someone that you really like working for, people will stay through all sorts of crazy challenges and headwinds, and even places where, like, for whatever reason, the comp's not very good. Like, I think people vastly underestimate the value of having that manager that's feel like this looking out for you, that's clearing out some of those obstacles, that has your career in mind. All those things are just incredibly valuable ways to get paid that aren't straight up cash. And the converse is true. If you have a crap manager, you could lose everybody in a particular team, and I've seen that happen too. It's not just demotivating the people that directly report to them, it can really demotivate the peers. If you've got a team that's way underperforming, and everyone's sort of vaguely aware that, like, each team needs to perform at a sort of a minimum level in order for the whole system to work, in order for the pipeline of product to feature development to QA to release, all that. If there's like some gaping hole in there, then it can be super frustrating from the standpoint of, like, well, no matter how good I do my job, there's nobody there to receive it, or there's nobody. I can make the best front end ever, but if there's no back end to go with it, well, that's going to be problematic. So, like, that sense of, like, the blast radius being even larger than the direct reports is really terrifying. People without a competent manager, I guess I touched on this already. They feel like they don't have an advocate. They don't have, the sort of the direction, the guidance, the mentorship. And, and some people, that's not first and foremost what they want, especially, you get like a principal engineer who's kind of seen a lot of stuff or whatever. But even then, principal engineers have their own set of needs, right? They need to be given, sort of things to work on that are sort of, at their level of expertise. They need to be not excessively saddled down with juniors if you can possibly help it, and so on and so forth, right? And that's, again, having that sort of individualized attention to what people's interests and needs are professionally, in addition to comp, I think is really important for, keeping tribal knowledge in the house, for keeping expertise in the house, for keeping social capital in the house. Like, it's really painful, like, when well-liked people leave. I mean, even, putting aside, tribal knowledge or skill set or whatever, it's just a bummer, when somebody who's liked and respected leaves. It happens. The only person that's going to manage your career is you, and so sometimes it's time to pick up and go. But that's all in the purview of the manager. And if anyone thinks that you're going to make a mess of that, it's pretty terrifying. Like, I had somebody at Lacuna who really wanted to be a manager, and I was like, maybe someday. I mean, you're getting so much better, and you've still got such a ways to go. And sometimes those conversations are really uncomfortable and hard. And sort of the last point is that there's a lot fewer manager positions, right? Like, and that's one of the things that's nerve-wracking about, being let go, or being on the market for any reason, really, is that, you'll see, 50 roles for every, 8 to 10 IC roles, there's that one line manager role. And for every, 4 to 5 to 8, line manager roles, there's that one director role. And for every, your typical company only has the one VP of engineering. So, like, once you get on that chain, right? Like, if you can find a place that's going to let you climb the ladder, awesome. But sometimes, you get into a position where, like, there's just no seats available, right? And we'll talk about them a little bit more in how do you get there. But, just that the simple math of there are fewer of those seats also can make it really challenging. So, questions, comments on the why? Why is it hard? Okay. I think probably 49 is going to do it for this discussion. We're down to 25 minutes, and so we'll just jump in. So you've considered your motivations, you've taken the classes, you've written down all the things that you need to do, and you started your studying, and you've understood that it's going to be, a challenge and potentially a slog, and there's no guarantee of success. What do you actually do at this point to get that first leadership job? Well, it's tough to get a job that you've never done before. It's much easier because so many jobs are like, well, we need 3 to 5 years experience and, whatever it is, right? So how do you get that experience? Well, there's a lot of jobs where you can get the experience without necessarily having the title. You have to be really careful about that because of the it looks bad if you overstep yourself. Like if you go off and like start acting like you have authority that you don't have, people will be like, that's a little nuts. And it can also be really frustrating from a colleague standpoint. Like if you have like a group of peers and one of them starts acting like, they're in charge when they have no formal authority at all, that can kind of really grate on everybody else. Like, who died and made you king, So, I think it's better to sort of look for opportunities, especially when you have an organization, say with like Agile or Scrum or whatever, where like, somebody has to be the Scrum Master, or somebody needs to be the liaison to product, or someone needs to, whatever, right? So look for those opportunities to go outside of some of your traditional IC roles, or look for places where the IC work overlaps with leadership work, particularly in sort of, attending to schedules or whatever. Like you're not going to, as an IC, you're not going to go randomly scheduling one-on-ones with people. Although, you just don't get to tell people what to do. I can schedule a one-on-one with, if I'm an IC, I could schedule a one-on-one, not just with my boss and start asking about leadership or whatever, but I can pick other, sort of line managers or directors and be like, okay, would you tutor me? And, dotted line back to, finding mentors, right? You don't have to have the job you want to find mentors who will mentor you on how to get the job you want, right? Like you can find people inside the company, and if you have some social capital with them, or you just find people that are particularly generous and say, hey, I have these aspirations, can you help me get there, right? And that's a place where, sometimes you might get work delegated. You might also just be really point blank with your boss, like, hey, if you need me to cover some aspect of your job, some little sliver of it that you want to delegate to me that wouldn't be traditional IC work, if there's something of yours that you want me to take over. Or, if your manager's going out of town, say, well, do you need me to sit in that meeting for you? Or, and maybe, you can be more aggressive or less aggressive. You can just say, oh, well, did you have anybody in mind, to cover in that meeting? Or do you need that? Do they, don't be like pushy and obnoxious about it, but, make it clear that that's the thing you're interested in. So that starts with, the conversation, right? That at some point you need to ask for what you want, because people aren't mind readers, and hopefully your managers also, if they're a good manager, they're pulling stuff out of you in one-on-ones, right? And when you're ready to start having those conversations, hopefully they'll say something like, what do you, want to work on the next quarter, the next year, whatever. Then you can start having, sort of the leadership conversation. And that very first leadership conversation, unless you're like some sort of gifted golden child of natural leader, your boss might not be that into it at first for a variety of reasons. One is because, again, all of the reasons why it's hard to get that role, or reasons why your boss might be kind of like, ugh, like, oh, I've got to train you up, or, B, there's aren't any roles here, and now manager's afraid of losing the IC. Or, maybe you're a really good IC and the boss just your manager doesn't want you to leave that role. That happens a lot in companies. Like when people are pretty good in the slots that they're in, they're often encouraged to just sit in that chair and like, crank on whatever it is they're good at, right? Um, having somebody go from a thing that they're really good at to a role that they don't have the experience and the skills, and presumably they're not going to want to take a salary cut. In fact, they're thinking, wow, if I'm a manager, then I get more money, right? So the person that's put in the position to decide if that's going to happen is like, okay, do I really want to pay more money to get less work, right? That might be a hard conversation. You might have to say, okay, well, we actually pay principal engineers substantially more than we pay line managers, for example. And so, the best you're going to do is no change in comp, but we might, because of banding, because of leveling, whatever, have to drop you down a little bit, right? So you might be confronted with that. But to convince your boss that, you're serious, that you're thoughtful, and that, it won't blow up in that person's face. That's, where all of this other prep work that I'm talking about, like where you're at least conversant in these topics, that you're mindful, that you're clear-eyed, that you know what you want, you can express what you want and why, but also that you're, to some extent you've done a lot of the work, and are willing to do whatever other work it takes. And like we did with Evan, like Evan was just point blank, I wanted to be on the leadership track, and we're like, okay. And Evan wasn't promised anything, but Evan was hardworking and smart and conscientious, and so that's what led to this. A lot of this curriculum was just like, okay, well, if Evan is going to be a junior manager, if at bare minimum, he better be conversant in all these topics, and have enough of a roadmap so that he's not just winging it, or he's not trying to continue to pretend to be an IC. Because I've seen people go into leaderships and sort of still want to do IC work for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to name names, but I think everybody's seen at least that one person who gets a new role, but they were really good at their last role, and they're not getting the positive feedback and the the little dopamine hits from being good at the thing that they were good at, and now they suck. Maybe they don't suck or whatever, but they're just they're not naturals. And that was so me. Oh my god, there were things that I was good at and things I was just terrible at, and I struggled to hear that. I was very unaccustomed to being told you're not good at this thing, because I was good at a lot of different things after shipping my first app in the age of 15. So anyway, sometimes you'll present your boss with this and they'll be like, look, we're not in a growth phase right now. And I mean, you can sit around and hope that somebody in leadership is going to like dip, but maybe not. So, don't be afraid to look elsewhere. And it's not just that there might be very few openings. It might be that, your peers have already, like, they see you a particular way. And sometimes it's very difficult to change people's sort of established perceptions, especially in my case. I was so immature because there was no selection pressure for me to be more mature than I was. Like, I was a really good IC, and so I could be sort of flip and eccentric and mouthy, and when you establish that you're a very skillful goofball, that's not the person you think about, like, oh, let's take the goofball and make them a leader, right? No. You have to take that stuff seriously, and that's why, like, you want to start acting leaderly, and that means upping your composure game. Like, watch other managers and compare them. They're the good ones, the ones you respect, the ones you think are competent and skillful. Like, just watch what they do, and they tend to comport themselves sort of more conservatively, but more thoughtfully and more cautiously in a lot of ways than ICs. Some ICs are very mature and quiet and thoughtful and reliable and whatever, but we're in tech. There's a fair number of eccentrics, and neuro divergent people who God love them, struggle with certain social conventions. And if you're gonna, sort of, you want to be seen a particular way, you better start acting in a particular way ahead of time to start turning, that very large boat ahead. So, and it also may be that the leader that you want to be won't really work in the current org. Like if you're a risk taker and you're aggressive and you work at a big company, maybe that's not going to work. If you're risk averse and you're in a startup, maybe that's not going to work, right? That you've been able to put up with it, but it's, as long as you didn't have to take the risks. But, you got to make sure that the place that you're seeking to become a leader is a place that, the values overlap enough. Don't just like do it where you're at because it's convenient. All right. And I've already touched on this a little bit, but like, act like you belong there, right? Exhibit these behaviors that give the other leadership people the confidence that, not that you'll behave, but that you will, compose yourself properly, that you will act with sort of maturity and discretion and all these other traits that we've been talking about this whole time. And I also touched on this earlier. Don't overshoot. Do not get too big for your britches. Do not claim any kind of authority that isn't explicitly granted to you. Do not create resentment in anybody if you can possibly help it, but particularly anybody that might be involved in sort of like decision making process. And, again, if you've gotten your boss to buy in where you're at, as, getting you on that leadership track, there are other ways that I haven't mentioned yet. So like, running a very small team or having like that one employee, like, when Evan was first given before even Evan was officially a manager, we gave him Colton and said, all right, well, here's your crash test dummy employee. And Colton was a really good example in some ways because, he was really easy to manage. It was not a big challenge for Evan. So Evan got, sort of like, leadership training wheels. And now I would trust Evan to run a team of, however many. And, getting an intern is also like a really low risk way of letting someone sort of try their hand at leadering, because interns don't know anything. And if you completely ruin an intern, the cost of that is pretty low. They're leaving in August, right? Like, or whenever, if, an intern or a co-op or something. So usually those interns have relatively low expectations, both on their side and sort of the company side. Like they're approximately free. So make sure that if you know that you have people who have it in for you in some way or another, if you have detractors, you have doubters, like really engage to the best of your ability to win them over, right? Because it doesn't take that many sort of negative voices. Like I've been in a lot of different, like just focal review cycles where, 3 or 4 or 5 people, will be, looking at a given person to sort of give them their annual. And they're like, yeah, basically fine, seems great, whatever. And then that one person who's got it in for them, they're like, well, did you know? And then the laundry list, the absolute worst things, possibly even shading them slightly, exaggerating, foregrounding poor behavior and, omitting maybe some good behaviors. Or, well, yeah, that person's great most of the time, but, every now and then they will lose their temper and just completely, whatever, right? And some of that stuff's hard to corroborate, right? It's like not that hard to sort of sow doubt. Now, like convicting somebody, that's a much higher standard, but just like placing some doubt in somebody feeds into that whole, yeah, it's really difficult to get that first leadership role, like because of the, all you have to do is put a little bit of doubt in whoever's the ultimate decision maker. And, well, let's just wait another quarter. Let's just wait another 2 quarters. Let's just, it can get kicked down the road where like it feels like it's just infinitely receding. Another way to sort of behave like, you belong there is to, dress for the job. And this is, again, super context dependent. Some places truly don't give a crap at all about, what you're wearing or whatever. Certainly I've worn my share of ridiculous outfits on Zoom calls over the years, but again, if you want to be seen as sort of leader material, you should be paying very close attention to the people that are in, the leadership cadre, and, don't do anything that would stick out unless you're really confident about it. There are people that can get away with, blue hair and side shaves, or, outrageous outfits or whatever, but usually those are people that are like really well established. Like, line managers don't tend to take those kinds of risks in most orgs. Again, it's not a hard and fast rule, but basically, try to fit in with the other leaders. Because again, anything that you do that's too out there is going to just cast that doubt. Is that person really ready? Is that person, putting their desire to be in a leadership role ahead of whatever their own sort of personal stylistic interests are? If those, style aspects are a distraction, right? Like, what's really your priority here? If you can't even be bothered to, you know, um, wear nice, halfway nice clothing. Again, you don't have to, like, again, don't overshoot, right? Like, you're showing up in a suit and tie every day, people are gonna be like, what the hell is wrong with you? So just, act like you belong there, and that includes dressing like you belong there. Sometimes, promotions happen sort of on the spot. My first leadership role wasn't that they opened a rec or anything. It was just one day, Hugh Martin woke up and was like, boy, we really need like sort of that 1 point person to run the software team. Yeah, I bet we could get Marie to do it. Like, and that was kind of it. Like, I hadn't even expressed any particular aspirations there. But if you do have those aspirations, right, you might be sitting around cooling your heels, or thinking that you'll get it in 6 months or a year, and then just like somebody quits, and then like, all right, next person up. So, they say, fortune favors the prepared. So, be prepared. So yeah, maximizing preparation, minimizes the risk, and that ties into the whole risk question. And also, as you're sort of, checking in with your manager, and again, don't pressure them too much. Patience is a virtue. And if you are, sort of on that track, just like make sure that your willingness to continue to mature and develop in that direction while maintaining your current job, like, just check in. What do you need to see from me? Ask for the job descriptions, right? Like, hey, do we have a job description standing around for, like, what is a, software line manager, what are all the skills and responsibilities? Like, use the local information, right? Like, I've sprayed a ton of stuff in the curriculum here, but not all of it's going to be in the foreground all the time. So figure out, like, what's most important. What are the pain points that you could solve for your manager or an adjacent manager or somebody? And it looks like that's redundant. Look for opportunities to practice. Let's see. Yeah, I think I already touched on all those things. Oh, I didn't touch on, you can study up on project management on the side, things like that. You could, take courses on that, what have you. But that's sort of in the larger picture of like continuing education. Get out in front of it. Like, don't wait till you have the job to go learn the skills that you need for the job. Do the book learning, and, again, be ready to jump in. Whew. All right, I think that's enough for today. Questions, comments about the topic of trying to get that first role?
Yeah, that was really hard for me.
Yeah.
I
Not
went
just you,
through.
Sweet, I promise.
I'm sorry, what?
It's not just you, I promise. It's everybody.
No, it took me a really long time to get to a point, because I've been doing a lot of that, like, stepping in for the boss, doing the meetings, leading the team. I did that at all the way from Yahoo, which was like 2010 onwards, to now, when it took me over 10 years to kind of break it into, you know, getting the role, even though I have all the skills and everything. It was really hard, because what I did and I should probably not say this to everybody, but for me, it was more my form of communication was too direct with people, and that was what was, something they want more diplomacy, and
Mhm.
that was the problem for me.
Yep, yep, yep. All right, anybody else before I end the recording? All right.